I think taxes should be higher. Hear me out. I recently went to Scandinavia visiting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, but I spent most of my time in Copenhagen, Denmark's capital and largest city. I've always been fascinated by the Scandinavian social safety net. Here in the US, we have a ton of social issues that aren't present, or at least aren't present to the same degree as they are in countries abroad. And it seems like one thing a lot of these countries have in common is a higher tax rate. Now in the US, it's been beaten into our head from a young age that higher taxes are bad. Think the Revolutionary War or pro-business policy. But Denmark is reportedly one of the happiest countries in the world while having one of the highest tax rates. And just for comparison, the US, the richest country in the world, doesn't even crack the top 20 in the world happiness rankings. So are Danish people happy to pay more taxes? Well, they kinda are. My name is Joel, and in this video, I'm gonna talk about what a United States with a higher tax rate and more efficient government could look like, by comparing it to what the Danes already get from their government. What Danes get that we don't. Free healthcare. The average American spends $14,570 a year on healthcare. The average Dane spends $1,000 a year on healthcare, mostly on prescription medication and dental care. In comparison, Denmark's total spending on healthcare, about $7,000 per capita, which again is mostly covered by the government, is high compared to other European countries. But the US has by far the most expensive healthcare in the world, and the Danish spending doesn't even come close. Public healthcare isn't perfect. Many countries have long lines, and some won't deal with minor issues unless you really bug them. But I believe any scheme that provides everybody care for a cheaper price per capita is better than a system with the highest cost per capita that still leaves millions un- or underinsured. Free higher education. The Danes get free education through university plus a stipend. The average American has $38,375 in just federal student loan debt. That doesn't include private loans or upfront payments. Any EU citizen residing in Denmark can go through as much university as they want for free. And in addition, Danish citizens and some EU citizens can get a $1,000 a month stipend that they can use for whatever they want, including housing and food. Honestly, even as a non-EU citizen paying full tuition and fees, it can cost you less than half as much to go to university in Europe, including Denmark, as opposed to most schools in the US. Getting a bachelor's degree from an in-state public school costs the average American $48,000. And a bachelor's from a private school costs the average American $168,000. And that's just tuition and fees. The same four-year degree from a Danish university costs a Danish citizen negative $48,000. Other freebies. Well, they're not free, they're paying for them, but it's a good value, in my opinion. Denmark has a generous mandatory parental leave. A couple gets 52 weeks of combined parental leave, 32 of which is paid, up to $3,200 a month. In the US, all you're guaranteed is 12 weeks of unpaid leave. Denmark also has mandatory paid vacation for all employees. It's a minimum of 5 weeks, but many employers offer 6, plus you get all the national holidays. In the US, there is no minimum, but most entry-level corporate jobs will give you 2 weeks plus federal holidays, and maybe after like 5 years of service, you'll get a 3rd week. Yeah. But all this must cost the Danes a lot more, right? Right? Well, Denmark, like the US, uses a progressive marginal tax system, meaning the higher your income, the higher your marginal tax bracket. The highest marginal tax bracket in the US is 37%. You pay this if you make more than $600,000 a year. Now, that's a lot of money. I'm gonna switch my marker because you can barely see that. The highest marginal tax rate in Denmark is 56%. That's kind of high. And you're in this bracket if you make more than $98,000 a year. That's a good salary, but not a filthy rich amount of money most people would say. But hold up, there is just one misconception a lot of people have about marginal tax rates. A lot of people believe that the marginal tax rate is the percentage of your income you pay in taxes. But that is simply not true. You pay the effective tax rate, which usually ends up being much lower than your marginal tax rate. Just in case you guys needed a demonstration of what the word lower means. That's a terrible error. But in the US, it works like this. Let's say you make $75,000 a year. You're gonna pay 10% on your first $11,600 of income, 12% on $11,601, all the way up to $47,150. And then you're gonna pay 22% on $47,151 all the way to your $75,000. Does this make sense, class? I'm trying new things. I'm trying to be engaging. I'm trying to do some analog activities. Maybe next time I'll just print these out. So even though your marginal tax rate is 22%, your actual tax rate is 15.4%. But let's do like the full math just to make sure you're following along. You pay $1,160 in the first bracket, you pay $4,266 in the second bracket, and you pay $6,127 in the third bracket, for a total of $11,553, which equals 15.4% of $75,000. Now keep in mind this is before deductions and credits are factored in, but Denmark has a very similar system. Even though the highest marginal tax rate is 56%, very few people end up paying anywhere near that much as their effective tax rate. And I'm going to illustrate that to you by sharing the total effective tax rate you'd pay at different income levels in Copenhagen, Denmark, New York City, and a random suburb in Massachusetts. I selected these three places because Copenhagen is Denmark's biggest and most expensive city, New York is America's biggest and most expensive city, and Massachusetts feels like a nice little control of a place where I could see myself living in 10 years if I ever decide to settle down. So our first income level is $30,000 a year, or about 2 times the federal poverty line. This is a common limit for a lot of social services in the US. In Copenhagen, you're paying a 31.3% effective rate, or $9,390 a year. In New York City, you're paying 19% effective rate, or about $5,702 a year. And in suburban Massachusetts, you're paying 16.6%, or about $4,971 a year. As you can see, living in a big city is more expensive than a small suburb regardless of the income, but it's actually quite a bit more expensive to live in Denmark, at least percentage-wise. But on to our next income level, we're gonna do $40,000 a year. This is the US median income, meaning if you chop off the top half of earners and the bottom half of earners, this number is right in the middle. Now I'm using this instead of the average because the average or mean can be heavily skewed by outliers. So in Copenhagen, at this income level, you're paying 31.1% effective tax rate each year, or about $12,440. In New York City, you're paying a 21.5% tax rate each year, or about $8,597. And in Massachusetts, you're paying 18.6% effective tax every year, or about $7,436. Again, there is a modest gap between the suburb and the city, with a larger gap between New York and Copenhagen. Our next income level is the average amount of income an American earns with a bachelor's degree, $80,000 a year. In Copenhagen, this income would effectively be taxed at 31.8% for a total of $25,440 being paid out to the government. In New York City, this income would be taxed at 27.5%, with a total of $22,022 going to the government. And in suburban Massachusetts, this income would be taxed at 23.9%, meaning you'd pay $19,121 to the government. And our fourth and final income level is the highest earners, the top 10%, and in the US, that is $170,000 a year. In Copenhagen, this would be taxed at an effective 39.1%, meaning you'd pay $66,470 to the government. In New York, this would be taxed at an effective 34.5%, meaning you'd pay $58,562 to the government. And in suburban Massachusetts, you'd be taxed at an effective 30.2%, meaning you'd pay $51,316 to the government every year. So consistently throughout the board, you're paying higher in Denmark. Not a surprise. But to be honest, in my opinion, the difference seems to be more than worth what you get. At least until you hit the very high incomes. I'm talking about like 200K or more a year, especially when you're looking at the big cities. For most Americans, these tax savings won't even offset healthcare costs. Let's take a look at the person making $170,000 a year. Let's name her Jocelyn. In New York City, Jocelyn pays about $7,900 less than she would in Copenhagen. But if we factor in healthcare costs, as I mentioned earlier, the average American pays $14,570 a year, and compare this to the average Danish cost of $1,000 a year, living in Copenhagen would actually save her $7,662 a year. Now factor in student loans, unpaid leave, and additional vacation time. And it seems like a lot of people may be better off financially, or at least more comfortable, in Denmark as opposed to the US. How is this possible? Well, first off, in most places, healthcare prices are set by the government. Whereas in the US, most healthcare costs are set by private companies, meaning they can charge you whatever they want and you have to pay it. Also, the US spends so much money on the military. We are the top spenders by far. We spend more than the next top 10 spenders combined. Just imagine how great of a country we could be if we put a fraction of our $1 trillion military budget towards healthcare, education, or public transit instead. Now, one of the starkest differences in the effective rates is between the lowest earners, and to be honest, I didn't expect that. The poorest Danes are paying almost double their American counterparts. Now, it is only a few $1,000s, but at those lowest incomes, it really does go a long way. But one stark difference being those poorest Danes have robust healthcare and the opportunity to educate themselves for free, while those Americans probably have either no healthcare or can barely afford it, and social mobility through education is just not an option due to the high costs. So back to my original question. How does this all reflect on happiness? Well, it seems to me a high standard of living and a robust social safety net leads to happier people. The US is like that Bugatti in a trailer park. Yes, we have wealth and power, but not a lot of protection if something does go wrong. Whereas even the poorest Danes, who are taxed heavier than the poorest Americans, are statistically happier. And it makes sense. Medical bills are the #1 cause of bankruptcy in the US. The Danes don't have to worry about that and so much more. The emphasis on a less stressed society creates happier people. Who would have thought? Now, when I was in Denmark, I actually had the opportunity to speak to a few Danes. I know, crazy speaking to Danish people in Denmark. But the majority of the people I talked to seemed to be happy to pay into this system. One guy I spoke to felt as if he was just paying back the system that has already helped him so much. You know, with the free healthcare and education and high standard of living. And I think that really highlights the difference between how a lot of American people and how a lot of Danish people think. It's individualism versus collectivism. It's the thought of I'm solely responsible for bringing me up versus I have a role to play in bringing everybody up together. It's a different way of thinking. Yeah, you won't be as filthy rich if you're a high earner, but if you're not, you will be comfortable, you will have work-life balance, and you will have stability. It's hustle culture versus hygge culture. I guess you only get that comparison if you know what hygge means. And most of you, not being Danish, I suppose, don't. So let me explain what hygge is. Hygge is a Danish word with no real English translation that encompasses this idea of coziness and contentment. Hygge is sharing a meal with friends or family, or zoning in on a really good book or movie on a peaceful day off. You're solely in the moment and you forget about the stressors of everyday life. That is, at least to my understanding, what hygge is. Danish people, please feel free to correct me in the comments below. But okay, now I can do the dramatic point of emphasis again. It's hustle culture versus hygge culture. Yeah, it just doesn't hit the same. Now, this video isn't to say Denmark is perfect. Through my research, I found some complaints about the unemployment benefits system. But to be fair, it's not like the US has great unemployment benefits as well. And in Denmark, your healthcare isn't tied to your employment status, so that is one less thing to worry about if you are unemployed. In addition, childcare, although subsidized in Denmark, is still between $500 and $800 a month. But the US average is still a tad higher at $1,000 a month. But the one major issue the US and Denmark both have in common are rising housing costs, especially in the biggest cities. That is one issue Denmark has not solved, but one European city kinda has. Vienna, Austria. They have one of the most robust public housing programs in the world. Now, when Americans think of public housing, they think of homes for the lowest earners, people making less than $30,000 a year. But when housing costs are going up everywhere, even in a place with a robust social safety net like Denmark, maybe it's time to rethink housing altogether. As a society, we've decided there are some things that we just shouldn't profit on for the collective benefit. Think roads, primary and secondary education, healthcare, unless you're American. With housing costs skyrocketing so high that even my centrist friends from childhood are complaining, maybe it's time we rethink what public housing means. Because in Vienna, public housing isn't just for the poorest people. About 60% of people in Vienna live in public or subsidized housing, where the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment is $700 a month. The average rent for a one-bedroom in New York City is at the low end $3,000 a month, with some sources having it even higher than $4,000 a month. If you make $80,000 a year and spend the recommended maximum of 30% of your income on housing, in New York, you can barely afford even a tiny studio within 30 minutes of Midtown Manhattan. And you definitely don't have in-unit laundry, a dishwasher, or central AC. Housing is only getting more expensive, and the current path we're on is not sustainable. Now, how we make housing affordable could be an entire video, or even the focus of an entire channel. Because housing is complicated and expensive, and everyone needs to live somewhere. And in a society as wealthy as ours, I believe everyone has the right to live somewhere. So before people rush to the comments and say, the housing crisis is actually a supply issue, or because of overregulation and zoning, or actually just plain old corporate greed. I know these are all factors as well. This is just one solution out of the many we'll probably need to solve this housing crisis. And I actually have a bit of personal experience with this as well. The county I grew up in had a robust public housing program for low and middle income earners. They had the typical low income housing developments, but in addition, they had a program where developers could, in exchange for low income mortgage financing, set aside a percentage of their units for low and moderate income housing. I grew up in one of these homes. My parents were able to rent and later purchase a home because of this program. It wasn't easy. There was a long waiting list. My parents wanted to buy, but they had to wait about a decade before even getting the opportunity to. But this program allowed my family with a moderate income to live in a neighborhood with some of the best public schools in the country. And I was able to get a quality primary and secondary education, allowing me to attend a great college, leading me on the path I am today, semi-employed and making YouTube videos. Upon editing this video, there are a few additional things I want to say. First, the Danish language is very hard. I've tried my best with pronunciation, but one thing I did get wrong is this word, I think it's pronounced more like Huga. I've been pronouncing it more like Haga, so that kind of sucks. But on a more serious note, I know earlier I did already say that Denmark isn't perfect because of X, Y, and Z, but I do want to reiterate that the US isn't hopeless and our only salvation isn't to literally become Denmark. I just want us as a society to adopt some of these ideas and values that have proven to correlate to a happier, in my opinion, better functioning society. And I especially want to emphasize values because these Scandinavian values of high trust in your neighbors and collectivism aren't present in the US for a variety of reasons. One being our very diverse politics and us just being a diverse nation. But I believe overall that diversity is a strength. It brings new ideas, different ways of thinking, and challenges the status quo. We as Americans shouldn't let our differences get in the way of building a society that works better for the common people. And lastly, I just want to conclude with, I believe that we should tax the rich first and implement many of these programs before we start raising the tax on the poor. America kind of has this tendency to half-ass its progressive policies. A great example of this would be congestion pricing. We implemented congestion pricing to reduce traffic, reduce emissions, and raise funds for the MTA. And so far it has done all three of those things. But we didn't couple it with a major expansion of public transit and micromobility options. We didn't increase bus service, we didn't expand the bike lane network, and we still haven't even increased subway frequency. Of course, big changes aren't going to happen immediately, but a lot of these smaller changes could have happened on day one. That's what I mean when I refer to an inefficient government. We can't just raise taxes on the poorest people and give that money to millionaires. Oh, what? We did do that? In the big, beautiful bill? What the fuck? In addition to this video, I've vlogged a lot of my experience in the Nordics. So if you want to learn a little bit more about these really cool countries, there should be an in-depth travel vlog coming out in the coming weeks. And just to pump their tires even more, another thing the Danes do really well that I didn't even mention in this video is biking infrastructure. And while I'd love to do a video about Danish biking culture and what we could learn about it here in New York, for now all I do have is this video about the biggest scam about biking in New York City. So if that kind of stuff interests you, check it out. But that's all for me for now. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you very soon. Bye.